I'd like to start off the day by sort of talking about prosopagnosia from a kind of scientific perspective. So we're going to hear some nice talks about what it's like to live with prosopagnosia, but we're going to start with some science. So I want to kind of persuade you that it's interesting to study the brain, hopefully, and I'm going to sort of try and tell you what prosopagnosia is and how we test for it. And I'm also going to be talking about what we can find out from using neuroscience techniques to find out what's going on in the brain in developmental prosopagnosia. So this is what we're interested in, the brain. Cognitive neuroscience is basically kind of the intersection between psychology and neuroscience. So the idea is quite simple. We think that the brain is crucial for all of the abilities that we have, all of our cognition. And what we've known for quite a long time is from studies of brain damage, for example, is that damage to the brain actually causes problems with intellectual functioning, for example. But what's even more interesting is that in very, very rare cases of brain damage, you can get very, very selective kinds of deficits. So if you get damage to a region down here in the brain, then you might have problems recognizing objects or faces, prosopagnosia. There's all kinds of selective kinds of deficits. You end up with these kind of strange situations where patients can perfectly well write a sentence for you. Intellectual functioning is completely fine, but they would be unable to actually read back what they'd just written, so they can't recognize words, for example. So basically, a useful metaphor maybe for kind of thinking about neuroscientific work is that the brain is a little bit like a computer. So it might be that in the brain there are circuits connected to each other and little microchips doing very, very specific types of things. But I wouldn't want to give you the impression that the brain is simply receiving information like a video recorder or something like this. It's actually actively interpreting everything that you see. So I'd like to give a visual demonstration of this, if I may. This is a visual illusion. And if you can all focus on the cross in the center of the screen. And while your eyes are on the cross, you might notice strange things happening to the faces that are presented to the side. Does anybody notice that the faces appear quite distorted? And if you move, the fun bit is trying to catch it. So if you move your eye to the face, you'll find that the faces actually look quite normal. And then you move your eyes back to the cross, and you'll see them kind of becoming a bit grotesque. So the brain is kind of actively trying to interpret the world, and you can get these very, very strange kinds of perceptual distortions. So basically, what is prosopagnosia? So basically, prosopagnosia is, as you all know, is a difficulty with familiar face recognition. So you can meet people quite a few times, and yet you're still unable to recognize people. So these individuals here are identical twins, and maybe a way for non-prosopagnosic people to think about what it's like having prosopagnosia is that it's a difficulty in picking distinguishing features between faces that you can use to actually recognize them. So it would be difficult for everybody to tell the difference between these faces. So for a lot of people who are here, it all started with this website, faceblind.org, in terms of research. So people would maybe realize that they have problems with face recognition, and maybe through the media, through a radio program or the newspaper, and they'll do an internet search, and you find websites like this, and then you will do an online test, and then you will see how you do on the test. And if it looks like you have face recognition problems, then information gets passed on to research groups like ours. So one of the kind of remarkable things that's been discovered over the last 10 or 15 years is that prosopagnosia isn't always the result of brain damage, but actually it's really, really surprisingly common in the general population. So this is just the number of people who seem to have prosopagnosia that have contacted our collaborator Brad Duchesne's website. As of a couple of days ago, the number of people who seem to have prosopagnosia who've contacted him is around 10,000 people as of a couple of days ago. So it's surprisingly common. But also you're in excellent company as well. So a lot of famous people seem to have prosopagnosia. So Brad Pitt, for example. This is Jane Goodall, the primatologist. Duncan Bannatyne, business tycoon. Oliver Sacks, who wrote popular books on neurology. He's written about prosopagnosia himself. And my favorite, Stephen Fry. So people will come to us saying they have problems with face recognition, but as psychologists, we want to test this. So we will give you a number of faces to learn. I'm sure most of you here have done these tests. So you will learn the faces from different views, and then it becomes much more difficult when we change the actual images that are being used. So we put different lighting conditions and add visual noise to these images. And it becomes very, very difficult for prosopagnosic people to recognize the faces. We're also interested in whether visual recognition problems are specific to faces or whether there are other recognition problems as well. So we'll test you with things like landscapes, objects like sunglasses, horses. Of course, most people with prosopagnosia find it difficult to recognize famous faces. And we're also interested in whether other aspects of face recognition are impaired as well, such as the ability to recognize emotional expressions. What we find in our lab is that, well, most people who do any kind of cognitive test will be somewhere in the middle of this graph here. So this is most people at the bump there. So like IQ or something like this. You'll have a lot of people performing around the middle where it's dark blue. And then you'll have kind of outliers, people who perform poorly on tests or very, very well. So people who come into our lab with prosopagnosia are somewhere here on these face recognition tests, in the bottom 2% of the population. This is kind of how we define it. But for other types of objects, like recognizing horses, for example, a lot of people with prosopagnosia find this surprisingly easy to do, although there is a lot of variability. And for emotional expressions as well, most people who we've tested seem to be very good at it as well. So that's prosopagnosia behaviorally. This is how we can standardize the tests. But what about the brain? So in modern cognitive neuroscience, we have these wonderful techniques that we can use for measuring brain activity. This is what we do in our lab, these caps with sensors on them. It's called EEG. And MRI as well is another very useful technique for measuring brain activity. MRI is really useful because it allows us to see these wonderful images of the brain. So you can actually look at brain structure and the kind of activity of the brain as measured by the blood flow in the brain. But not only that, you can also see kind of the wiring of the brain as well, these white matter tracts that run through the brain and connect up different regions. So how do we think face processing works in the brain? Well, what's really surprising is that although our kind of visual world appears to be like a kind of continuous experience and everything is seamless, different parts of the brain seem to be working on very, very specific types of things. So, for example, this little green region at the back here of the brain in the visual area is responsive to images of the human body, for example, very specifically. The purple areas are responsive to things like landscapes, and what we're really interested in is faces. So there are these face-selective brain regions that respond more to faces than other types of objects out there in the world. There isn't just one brain region that's doing this. So some of you may have heard of the fusiform face area. There are actually lots of other regions that are doing face processing as well. So we can have a look and see what these techniques are telling us about what the brain basis of prosopagnosia is. It might be really simple, like in cases of brain damage, where a very specific part of the brain gets lesioned, and you can sometimes have a very specific deficit. Or with developmental prosopagnosia, we don't think it's to do with brain lesions, but perhaps these face-selective regions don't develop in the typical way. So you can put people with prosopagnosia into an MRI scanner, and you can have a look and see whether these brain regions light up to faces. So what we're seeing here on the left-hand side, and I just want to draw your attention to the red area that says FG on it there. This is the fusiform face area in people from the general population. And it turns out that when you put prosopagnosics in the scanner as well, they show exactly the same kind of region that's also working. So it can't be as simple as these brain regions don't exist in developmental prosopagnosics brains. So what we do in our lab is we're not using MRI, we're using EEG. And so one idea might be that, okay, these brain regions are there in prosopagnosia, but maybe they're just not responding very quickly, for example. So we can use EEG to really measure this on a really fine timescale. So we put caps on people, and we get these brain signals that many of you are familiar with, and we make you look at lots and lots of faces and lots of objects and things like this, and we cut up this signal, and we get these nice brain waves that come out of it at the end, these ERPs. So if you're interested in face processing, the N170 component is a brain response that distinguishes faces from other types of objects, and it happens very, very quickly. So within like 1/5 of a second, your brain has already decided whether something's a face or not. And what you can see here is this is from the back of the head. We call it a scalp map. And this activity in blue that you can see here is kind of where those face-selected brain regions are that we saw on the MRI scan. So we know that people in the typical population show this effect. And as you can see over here, the bits in blue on the left-hand side there. And it also turns out from a study that we did in our lab a couple of years ago that people with developmental prosopagnosia also seem to show this same kind of brain response. So it's there, these brain regions seem to be active, and they're active very quickly as well. So far, we haven't explained very much about what's actually going on in developmental prosopagnosia, but there are other ideas about what might be going on in the brain. So, as I discussed before, there are these kind of fibers, or you can think of them as like connections between different brain regions. And could it be that these brain regions are there, but maybe they're not communicating with each other very well? So what you can see here is a very, very specific cable that's running through the visual system and to sort of memory areas in the brain. And these nice big blue lines are these cables in people from the general population. And then when scientists have looked at what happens in developmental prosopagnosia, we see a slightly different pattern. So it could be that people with developmental prosopagnosia have much smaller connections between these areas that might be really important for face recognition. Although, if you notice the two at the end there, they look like they have quite normal-looking connections between brain areas. So maybe this doesn't explain it for everybody. So, okay, this first piece of evidence that there's something slightly different in developmental prosopagnosics brains. Well, is it like there are damaged circuits in the brain and there's nothing you can do about it? I wouldn't want to give that impression. So one of the amazing things about the brain is that it's kind of rewiring to some extent all the time, especially when you learn things. So there was a study that I really liked where they measured these white matter, these cables that are in the brain before people learnt to juggle, and then they taught them how to juggle, and then afterwards they found that there were connections between areas involved in motor coordination and spatial awareness. So your brain is actually restructuring itself all the time. So the point I'm trying to make is that most people become face experts. We practice with faces every day, and obviously this doesn't happen for everybody. This is Barack Obama. He's upside down, he's harder to recognize. But what you might not have noticed is that all of his facial features were turned upside down. So when he's upside down, it's quite difficult to tell, actually, that the mouth and the nose and so on are oddly configured. And then when we turn him back around, he looks quite grotesque. But this isn't something that we're born being able to do. this is something that happens over development. So what I'm showing you here is changes in face recognition for upright faces and upside down faces over time. So the black bars are sort of recognition accuracy improving from young children to adults, and the white bars are performance with upside down faces. So with upright faces, we get all this experience throughout our lives, and we get much better at recognizing people. And for upside down faces, we don't see much of an improvement over time. So in a way, children, like people with prosopagnosia, are not face experts. So can we see any changes in brain activity in developmental prosopagnosic brains when we present faces upright and upside down? So we can go back to this M170 component that I was talking about earlier. Over these, we measure over electrodes over these face-selected brain regions. And it's not only sensitive to whether there's a face, whether you're looking at a face or not, but also the orientation of the face as well. So as soon as you see something upside down, we don't see these things very often, this component gets very, very large. So this experiment that we did a couple of years ago in our lab found that in our control group, we show exactly this effect. Larger, the dashed line is larger than the solid line. And in the developmental prosopagnosic group, we see, if anything, the opposite direction or no difference between upright and inverted faces. At first, this was kind of puzzling, but when you actually look at the studies that have been done with children under the age of 10 years old, you actually find a very, very similar pattern emerging here. Another thing that's kind of related to this is that these white matter tracts also get larger and improve over development as well. So just to summarize what's happening in the brain in developmental prosopagnosia, there's no obvious brain damage. It's not like cases of acquired prosopagnosia. Parts of the brain do become specialized for face processing, which is quite promising. However, the development of these regions is obviously not quite going the typical way. So this sensitivity to things like seeing faces in the configuration that you'd see them in everyday life, it hasn't quite developed in the typical way. And there's also some hints that there might be some kind of disconnection between brain areas that are involved in face recognition as well. I'd like to thank everybody who has been involved in this work, Martin Eimer, Angie Gosling, our collaborator Brad Duchesne, Katie Fisher, and Joanna Parketney, and the ESRC. Thank you very much.